go. Okay, worked.
Good.
Okay, so thanks for being here. Stephanie Erickson, caregiving expert, and I'm the author of Plan for Aging Well. And I have with me today Dr. Barry Jacobs. He's a clinical psychologist, and he's the author of 3 books. He's got a head start on me. Let's see, the names are, let me read them. The Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers, Meditations for Caregivers, and his newest book he wrote with his wife, Julia Meyer, who's also a psychologist, and that's called Love and Meaning After 50. He also does a monthly column on AARP. So thank you very much, Barry, for being here with me.
Thank you for having me, Stephanie. Really my pleasure to be here.
So we spoke a long time ago. That was when I was doing a podcast. That was like, I swear, like 6 years ago or something. 7, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, very long time ago. And now I'm picking it back up again. But I like this better, doing it with the video and stuff too. I like it much better because last time we didn't get to see each other, and now we get to see each other.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
Yeah, it is good. So, first of all, you wrote a book with your wife. Now, since COVID, I mean, my husband would sometimes work at home, but now he's like always at home 24/7. We're always together. And he's a great guy. He's very calm. He's very independent. He appreciates my independence. So there's not major issues going on, but at the same time, 24/7, like sometimes I do want to wring his neck, if I'm honest. How did you write a book with your wife? I'm not sure my husband and I would have survived that.
So we actually wrote 2 books. So the last book, Meditations for Caregivers, my wife
Oh, sorry. Okay.
and I also wrote. So how do we do this? So what happened is our kids grew up and moved away, and we were empty nesters. And as empty nesters, uh, we're not such a child-focused family anymore. And so we had this free time that I suppose we could have each gone off and done our individual hobbies or interests, but instead we decided to do something together, something that would enhance our relationship. So we very consciously decided we wanted to write a book together. And then we had the opportunity 4 years later to write a second book. And the first experience for the book that published in 2016 was a good experience. I think it helped our relationship. Particularly, that book was a lot about we each had experiences as family caregivers caring for our own parents, and we didn't do that individually. Obviously, I mean, I helped her with her parents, she helped me with my parents, and then the book was an opportunity for us to really begin processing what we had each been through, and so that brought us together emotionally. And the second book, which was specifically about relationships for folks over 50, including those who were empty nesters, was again an opportunity for us to reflect on our own relationship, as well as what we were learning from our psychotherapy clients and friends, and what we read from in the research literature. So I think it wasn't always easy, and there are times when we may have butted heads on things, but generally speaking, writing both books really strengthened our marriage and helped us kind of deal with emotional issues that we were already contending with. So I think these were very good things. And in terms of the process itself, years ago, Julie and I had written for WebMD and Health Central, which were health-related websites. We had kind of a precedent for writing together, and typically we each write drafts, and then we edit each other's drafts, and then we kind of go back and forth. So there's it requires a lot of trust. But generally speaking, she's happy with my editing of her work, and I'm happy with her editing of my work. We have to find a way to kind of arrive at one voice. You can have 2 voices in a book, but we had an overall book editor to help with that. But most of the time we got along pretty well. The main thing is I tend to procrastinate more, and Julie is much more efficient. So when I wrote my first book on my own, it took me 6 years to write it. I was 4 years overdue with delivering the book. When we wrote the second book, we wrote it in 6 months because Julie was a taskmaster and just kept us moving along, which was probably very good.
Did it reveal anything different about your relationship or communication patterns or personality traits, or was there something different that you discovered about each other that you didn't know in your everyday relationship and dealing with other challenges that you might have?
Uh, I think mostly it kind of brought to the fore things that we already knew about each other. For instance, she's uh, uh, very type A, very on top of things. I'm a little bit more loosey goosey. Um, that we learned, particularly with our last book, we learned about each other's personal perspective on our experiences, caregiving for our own parents, but also caregiving for our in-laws. And so we kind of revealed ourselves to each other through this process. And I think that happened with this latest book, Love and Meaning After 50, as well. That it gave we were writing we weren't writing about our own, writing about three other relationships, but there were aspects of our relationships that would come to the fore in the stories that we told about those three other couples. Sometimes I would read something that Julie had written and say, "Oh, that's really about us," or that applies to us. It was a way for us to kind of communicate through in a way that we had never been able to, or hadn't tried through verbal conversation.
So you brought up caregiving, and I want to talk about that in terms of the preservation of the relationship. There's all different caregiving situations that can fall on couples. It could be one taking care of the other, a spouse taking care of a spouse. Good morning, Arturo. You just said good morning. Good morning to you too. It could be a spouse taking care of a spouse. It could be two parents taking care of a child, either an adult child or a minor child who has some sort of developmental delay or a mental illness, whatever that might be. And then there's also the probably more common caregiving scenario we think about, which is taking care of our aging relatives. And you mentioned that you and Julia, your wife, took care of your own parents and had to support each other. In your experience personally, and also with the other caregivers that you work with in your practice, what do you think, some of the bigger challenges are when caregiving hits a couple? What are the challenges, not the caregiving piece, but the couple piece, like the preservation of that relationship?
I think it's all about where you put your time, how where you put your time and energy, and so one of the things that happened with us early on, um, and just to give you a little bit of the backstory, in 2010, my mother and stepfather were living in South Florida. My stepfather had moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease. My mother was really struggling taking care of him, and she was becoming increasingly frail. Actually, Julie's idea to move them up to an apartment a mile from our home in Pennsylvania. She was as invested in caring for them as I was, but I felt compelled to have dinner with them 2 or 3 nights a week, and that was probably more than Julie wanted to see them. And so she felt that I was devoting a lot of energy for them that was taking away from her and from our then teenage kids. And so she recognized it was just out of guilt. I mean, I felt bad for my mother and stepfather. If I was home with Julie and our kids and we were having a good old time, and I knew my mother and stepfather were struggling a mile away, it was just difficult for me. So that became something that we would talk about and had to negotiate. And eventually, I was able to find a way to feel like I was doing things for my mother and stepfather, and better balancing it with my marital responsibilities and responsibilities as a father. But
So wait, let me stop you here because I want to explore that a bit longer, because it was your wife's idea to bring your mom and stepdad closer to you, and then you were doing this balancing act with having children as well. I mean, they were teens, so there was probably less like pickups and I have to help someone into the bath type work, but still your teens need your time and attention. Did you anticipate that it would have that kind of an impact, your balancing, or were you expecting it? Like, did you and your wife have these preemptive conversations about what her expectations were about the time that you would give to your parents and then give to your family? Did you have that discussion in advance?
We did. I mean, we sat down with our kids and said, "This is what's going to happen, and our lives are going to be different." And our kids were not happy about it, frankly. But we had that conversation with them. We had some conversation just with the two of us, which was probably not detailed enough. I mean, we didn't get down to the nitty gritty of like how many nights a week we're feeding my mother and stepfather. When it came down to the nitty gritty, then we discovered that we weren't seeing this entirely eye to eye. So then we it needed some further uh, discussion. But I mean, I think that we did this with our eyes open that this was going to change what happened, how we live day to day, and it did. I mean, we had my mother and stepfather up here for about 7 years before first my stepfather died and then my mother died, and it changed our relationship. And it changed the amount of time we spent together for a long period. And but I would also hasten to add that I think it is. I mean, I didn't get along with my mother or stepfather particularly well, and Julie became this kind of peacemaker oftentimes, and she could deal with them in ways that I couldn't, and I came to rely on her for that. And it just increased my regard for her that she would take on this thankless task and deal with them. They were not easy to deal with, and I mean, it made me love her all the more that she would do this.
That's really nice. It's really nice that it strengthened your relationship. And another thing that you said that I like is that you brought your children into the discussion, and I know they weren't happy with it. And I mean, as we know in families, you're rarely pleasing everybody at the same time. But it impacts the entire family system. So to make that kind of a decision without the inclusion of your children would have been detrimental, I think even more probably to the family dynamics. And I think, as you said, by having, I guess, the ongoing open discussions, it helped to strengthen your relationship with you and your wife. Now, when people have young kids, I mean, everyone will say, oh, the couple has to make time for each other. It can't just be about the kids. They have to keep their relationships strong. It's really hard to do that when you have children. My husband and I are terrible at it. Of course, we can't go anywhere now anyway, but even pre-pandemic, we've never really been good about setting that time aside for us as a couple. It's either us as with the kids or us individually pursuing our own things. What do you recommend for people who are in this kind of a situation? Like, how can they manage that guilt of not being with their parent in order to give their partner some time? Like, how can they do that, and how essential is that?
I mean, I think it's extremely essential, and it's also really tough. I mean, honestly, I mean, and I spent a lot of time. I spent decades with couples dealing with this, and as a counselor, and when it came to my own life, I mean, I was just inundated with guilt. I mean, I didn't feel like I was a good enough son or husband or father. I felt like I was spread so thin I couldn't do anything right. I just felt awful a lot of the time, and actually getting emotional thinking about it. Even though it's more than 3.5 years since this is now behind me. But, uh, it really took a lot of intentional. I mean, basically seeing that I'm a limited human being. I only have but so much time and energy that I had to divvy up my time in a way that was fair to everybody as well as to myself. And that when it came to kind of replenishing myself, it was really the time with my wife, with Julie, that made the most difference. And that if I wanted to do a good job in all my other facets of life, I really needed to spend time with her. I couldn't neglect that. And that was a lesson that took me a little while to learn. I didn't just kind of it didn't dawn on me in a week. It dawned on me in a year. You had to work toward that.
And I think, I mean, you're saying so many things that I'm connecting with, and that intentional process, the intentional balance that we need to try and strike. But the other thing that you said that I think we all need to remember is that we're only human, and we probably, in so many situations in our life, I find that most people don't feel like they're good enough in any way. We all have these expectations of perfection and what things are going to be, and it's very hard to achieve that. So probably part of the work is just accepting that you're doing everything that you feel like you possibly can, and appreciating all the efforts that you're making, that your kids are making, that your spouse is making, that your parents are making, and just kind of accepting that it is enough. If you're there, if you're putting your heart and soul into it, doing all you can, it is enough. And maybe once people can get to that place of like accepting and forgiving themselves, that they're not going to achieve this, perfect scenario, that probably helps you cope. Well, it does for me anyway, personally.
I agree with you. I mean, I always say to folks, good enough is good enough. I mean, and now especially with COVID, I say to folks, muddling through is good enough. That no one's going to do this well. No one, everyone's going to just get things done the best they can, and that has to be okay. And that mostly folks don't need perfect caregiving. They need good enough caregiving, and I certainly provided that for my mom and stepdad. I mean, in retrospect, I'm not happy with all the ways I acted or everything I said or all the decisions I made, but on balance, I'm relatively pleased with how it turned out, and that I helped them make a soft landing. I mean, they were at the end of their lives, and uh, suffering with cognitive issues and suffering with other physical health issues, and they make a soft landing, and I take pride in that now, even though at the time it was really tough.
Yeah, and especially if you were having complications in your relationship, like you were saying, they weren't the easiest people. So that's like another layer of difficulty where you don't even, and I'm not suggesting that you didn't like them, but there are people in our lives who we may not even like. And I see that a lot in my work where, I have caregivers who are caring for somebody, supporting them, and then other healthcare professionals will say to me like, oh well, the daughter never visits, or when she visits she only stays for 10 minutes. Of course I know the backstory, and in my head I'm like, you have no idea how horrible this mother was to this daughter. Like, I respect her so much for even just showing up and giving whatever she possibly can, because we have to preserve ourselves as well too. And I don't think we can judge people for the amount of effort and time they put into caregiving, because we don't know the histories of those relationships.
I hear you, and I agree with you. But I will say that people do judge, and other family members judge, healthcare and social service professionals judge
Yep.
because they don't have the backstory, and they have in their mind what a child, adult child should be doing for a parent with certain needs, and that's extremely unfair. And I can tell you, having worked in healthcare for 30 years, that I saw it every day. I mean, I saw it in the hospital all the time, that people made assumptions about relationships that, especially if an adult child was showing up at the hospital, we assume that they love their parent and they want to take care of them. Well, that's probably not always the case, and or they were ambivalent about the amount of commitment that we're willing to make. And healthcare providers need to understand the backstory more. Other family members need to understand the backstory more to see it in its proper context.
Yeah, 100%. There was a comment that I can't see. I just want to say, bringing the family together is vitally important. Ebony Green. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Ebony. You're right. And hello, Rebecca, who also commented. Let's get into your book, Love and Meaning After 50. So, as we're aging, I know you can't tell, but I'm also 50.
No, I would never be able to tell that.
And that is the right answer. um, and my husband and I, and especially because of the work I'm in, we are talking about aging and what we would like our aging experience to look like. And there are so many things that we need to be discussing proactively as couples. In your book, what are some of the hot topics that you address that, as we age together, 50 and beyond can be a beautiful time as a couple, rediscovering each other after the kids have moved out of the home and that kind of a thing, finding passion and maybe slowing down on work. So many beautiful things can happen. But in terms of the relationship, we need to evolve together. What are some of those hot topics that you address in your book about how we can do this together as a couple?
You've already hit upon some of the important ones. I mean, so when couples go from being child focused to being more focused on themselves and one another, that's an adjustment, and it's again one that requires an intentional approach. That there needs to be some conversation because the expectations may not be aligned. So that a lot of what's written in our book is We have conversation guides about how couples could talk about how do we handle the empty nest, how do we handle downsizing, how do we handle thinking about retirement, planning for retirement, how do we handle money issues as we go forward. Because what I have seen in my own practice is spouses not infrequently have very different ideas of what life is going to be like as they get into their 60s and 70s, and that may mean they may really be at odds. Someone may want to move south and into warm weather. The other person may be absolutely determined to stay near the grandchildren one day, and that leads to conflict. Uh, there are there may be differences of opinion about whether you should move out of the family home that you've been living in for 20, 30, 40 years or not. There's often disagreement about that. So there is, I would say, by and large, most couples over 50, well. That said, the divorce rate among couples over 50 has doubled in the last 20 years, and for those over 65, it's tripled. Partly it's because we have this baby boomer cohort that's entered those issues, and baby boomers as a generation have divorced more than any other generation before or since. But I also think that, especially when people's life expectancy, if you're in a marriage that you're lukewarm about, and you're 60 years old, you figure you're going to live another 25, 30 years. Do you want to hang out with this person, potentially be their caregiver one day, or they develop health problems? And there are a group of people out there who basically say, no. I mean, I've been putting up with this garbage for too long. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it 5 years from now. I don't want to do it 20 years from now. So the time to get out is now. And maybe with any luck, I'll find a better life for myself. And so people bail. People bail in their 60s and even 70s, hoping for better.
Yeah, and I understand that because we've only got one shot at this, right? So we want to make sure that we feel good about ourselves, our life, and the person we're with. I've seen a lot of some of the situation you just mentioned. It's very interesting because I've had one of my really good friends. Her and her husband split. She's not way before 50. They split when she was in her 40s, but even at that time, as their kids were starting to get older, he was talking about wanting to move down south and live the beach life. And she's like, "What are you talking about? I want to have my grandkids down the street from us." So even in the 40s, that began to put a wedge in their relationship as they were planning for that. And then when you talk about moving, I know my mom and my stepdad have gone back and forth of where they're going to move, and if they should move. And they're talking about moving away from the family for taxes. I'm like thinking, yeah, but mom, you're going to be in your 80s. Why would you move further away from all of us? That doesn't make sense. So it's not even just the couple, it's the impact on the rest of that family system. When we were talking about that, like, again, it's like a whole system impact, right? So do you think, though, that couples, as their kids leave the home and they're in their early 50s, are they having, like, deeper, more layered conversations? Is it just about, okay, are we going to move? Are we going to downsize? Or are they talking about, if I'm old and I need care, I expect you to care for me in the home. If I have dementia, this is what I want you to do. Do you think people are getting that specific? And should they, starting in their 50s?
I don't think people are getting that specific. And I mean, I think it's a hard conversation to have. I mean, first of all, nobody wants to talk about, like, well, if I'm demented 20 years from now, will you care for me? I mean, that dementia is the scourge of our time. Nobody likes to think about that. I also think that he wants to kind of hear that the other person may not be interested in caring for them. But that said, would it be good for people to talk about how they would handle a health crisis, either a sudden health crisis like a heart attack or stroke, or gradually progressing health crisis like Alzheimer's disease? Yeah, they should. And, I mean, some of that is a matter of financial planning. We buy long-term care insurance. Do we downsize now, to get out of the multi-story home in the event that one of us gets
Yeah.
Parkinson's disease or can't walk up and down the stairs anymore? So some of that is very pragmatic, but some of it is more emotional. Are we so committed to one another that we will be there for one another, almost regardless of what occurs? That's a hard conversation to have. I
Oh
think
my God, that, like, it just, like, makes me sick to my stomach to think that if I said to my husband something a question like that, and his answer was, "No, I don't think I'm that committed. I don't think I could do it." I mean, I can't even imagine hearing those words come out of his mouth, yet it would be important for him to tell me that so I could plan, right? But, oh my god, what a hard conversation. Do you have guides like that in your book, these really difficult conversations?
We have a chapter specifically on caregiving where we have
Mm,
people talking about how do we face whatever's going on together and make decisions that are not simply one person sacrificing themselves entirely for another, but really taking both spouses' needs into account. And how do we look forward into the future? Generally people don't get healthier as they age; they get more infirm, and so they need to plan for this. And so yes, we have conversation guides for that conversation. Um, I think a lot of what we talk about in the book is how do people find a sense of shared purpose going forward,
mm,
because I mean, there's so much writing now about how as people age, it sounds like they retire and then sit on the rocking chair and while away their time till they die. I mean, more and more of us, and I'm 62. A couple of years ago, I started a new career. uh, Many of us are doing that. Many of us are working later. Many of us are still uh, identifying things that are important to us that we want to devote our time to while we can. And so those purposes of the sense of mission that people have is very important, but so much better if a couple can form a shared sense of mission. That way their activities are dovetailing, because if they form two very different ideas, one wants to devote to the other wants to save the world and wants to travel all over the place, then the way their time is spent will be very different, and they'll be more apart than together, and that takes its toll on their degree of togetherness eventually.
the shared mission, that's such a beautiful way to put it. I think, when we have young kids, we have the shared mission of, raising kids who are functioning and self-sufficient and independent and happy and, kind, right? Or whatever your priorities are. So that's the shared mission. And earlier when you were talking about caregiving, how you and your wife both were implicated in the care of your parents, and you had a shared mission there. So she was stepping in and doing things, thankless things, really for you, probably more than she was for them, of the shared mission of, I want to help my husband get through this process of caring for these people when it's a difficult situation for him. Again, a shared mission. But you're right, like once the kids are out of the home, there needs to have some continued of shared mission. How do how what would you say to people, like, just be flexible, be open, try a million things, brainstorm, make a list of the top 50 things you imagine yourself doing, and then you try and find similar ground? How do you do that?
I mean, fortunately, people aren't starting from zero. I mean, they've lived together for a long time. They came together likely because they have shared values, and oftentimes they have a shared perspective on the world. And so that's where you start, and you start with some conversations about, okay, if we have 20, 30 years left, what's really important to us? I mean, how do we really want to devote our time, and how do we structure our lives in such a way that we really actualize the things that are important to us, and we're not just running living, we're not just paying bills, but that we're doing things that we're making the most use of our time. And so what matters kind of moves to the forefront more, I just think, as people age. And I think especially during this pandemic, I mean, so many people have talked about it, it's really clarified what matters, because we're not running around like chickens without our heads so much. More of us are home, and just giving us more time to reflect on our lives. So to have those conversations about what matters together, to plan a life going forward together, really does strengthen our relationships. But by the same token, if it's real divergence of opinion, if there isn't, if those conversations don't take place and people just go off on their own, I do think it detracts from the quality of the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. So Barry, how can people find your book? Is it available? I know you have your website, loveandmeaning.com. I think it is. It's a .com. Yeah.
Yes.
And can we get all your books there? Do they go on Amazon? How can people find your work?
I mean, all the books are there at loveandmeaning.com. Uh, like every other book in the world is available on Amazon. Uh, I mean, and just to talk about shared purpose, I mean, Julie and I went from focusing on caregiving to focusing on couples getting older. It's just a kind of an extension of caregiving, but really what we want for everyone and what we want for ourselves is how do we help everybody approach these difficult tasks toward the end of life with as much intentionality, with as much kind of mutual empathy and care for one another, and make that soft landing that I hope we all make.
And aside from the book, which obviously people can do that reading and the work on their own, do you or your wife, especially now, I mean, I know you're in California, is that right?
We're outside of
Oh, no,
Philadelphia.
that's right, you just mentioned that earlier, Pennsylvania, sorry, slipped my mind, came back as I was saying the words California, realized I was making a mistake. Can people consult with you online about this? Can a couple meet with you? I mean, is that a good idea to have some sort of I mean, I don't wanna say it's therapy, it's a coaching/therapy slash therapy, really about how do we, find that shared mission and build a life together. Can people find you that way too?
Yes, I mean, I think loveandmeeting.com would be the best way to contact us. And yes, both Julie and I have psychotherapy practices full of folks who are older, individuals and couples, and we talk about these issues with them all the time. And a lot of what's in the book Love and Meeting After 50 is a kind of approximation of what different couples have said to us about empty nest, caregiving, downsizing, moving, all the challenges of this point in life.
Yeah. Yeah, I just a side note before we end, I wanna tell you that once I've said something to my son, he's 12 now, about, "Oh, well, papa," and because we speak French here, so papa is what we say. "Hey, papa, and I might, wanna sell the home at some point, there's stairs and there's a basement, and eventually, it might be hard for us." My son was like, "Excuse me? You're gonna sell our home?" So, like, there's these other things to think about. So what he told me was he has a dream of being in the NFL. He's like, "Wait until I make it to the NFL so I can afford to buy that house so I can keep it forever." I said, "Okay, fine." But, it's interesting how these couple discussions really impact the whole system, right?
For sure, selling the family home impacts everybody. Making I'm sitting in my son's old childhood bedroom, which is
Okay.
turned into my office, but in back of me are all of his books that he was reading as a teenager, and one day I'm going to say to him, you need to clear these books out, and he's going to say, "No, I can't get rid of those books." So yeah, everybody has feelings about that.
Exactly, exactly. Well, thank you, Barry. Great speaking with you. Appreciate it. And thank you for everyone who was listening in. And take care of yourself. Barry Jacobs, you can find his book on loveandmeaning.com and some of his other books as well. You can also connect with him for consulting and Plan for Aging Well, my book, you can also find on Amazon should you wish, whoops, to take a look at it and learn more about me on my website, stephanieerickson.ca. Okay, thanks, Barry.
Great, thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.